There are television shows that feel like furniture. They become so naturally embedded in the weekly rhythm of a household that their presence stops being something you choose and starts being something you simply expect. You do not decide to watch them so much as you find yourself in front of them, comfortable and at ease in the way that only familiarity produces. Last Man Standing was that kind of show for millions of American families. Friday nights, the Baxter family. Tim Allen doing what Tim Allen does better than almost anyone else on television, and a particular kind of humor that managed to be genuinely funny, while also being willing to say things that primetime comedies in its era generally avoided saying. And then, one by one, the faces that audiences had come to rely on started disappearing. Some left quietly, some left loudly, some came back changed, some never came back at all. The official explanations offered at the time were tidy and professional, and left most of the actual story unaddressed. The real reasons behind why the cast of Last Man Standing kept shifting, kept shrinking, and eventually reassembling in a different form on a different network are considerably more interesting than anything the press releases contained. The story of the show begins with a man who almost did not do it. Tim Allen had already established himself as one of the most successful figures in television comedy history when the offer came to him for Last Man Standing. He had spent years on one of the most beloved family sitcoms of its era, had built a film career that included one of the most successful franchise runs in the history of family movies, and had reached the point in a career where offers arrive regularly, and the question is never whether work is available, but whether any specific piece of work is worth doing. He turned the offer down multiple times. The character of Mike Baxter felt too similar to what he had already done, and the idea of essentially repeating himself at a different network with a different premise did not appeal to someone who had already succeeded so definitively in that territory. The producers kept coming back because they needed him specifically, not a version of him or someone adjacent to him. The show's concept depended on a specific kind of presence that Allen had, and most people in his business did not. What finally moved him was not the character or the concept, but the control. The deal that brought him to Last Man Standing included executive producer status, with genuine creative authority over the show's direction. That mattered to someone who understood, from experience, that the difference between a show that says what it wants to say and one that gets smoothed into safe inoffensiveness is almost always a question of who has final authority in the room. Allen wanted that authority. The producers needed his name and presence badly enough to give it to him, and the agreement that resulted from those competing needs shaped everything that came after. The show launched to numbers that surprised even the people who had believed in it. The premiere drew an audience large enough to make it the most successful comedy debut on its network in years. Viewers who had wondered whether Allen could anchor a family sitcom a second time found their answer immediately. The show worked, the audience arrived and stayed, and for 6 seasons Last Man Standing delivered ratings that any network would have been grateful to have on any night of the week, let alone the night that television has historically treated as the graveyard of broadcast ambition. The first significant cast departure happened before most viewers had even fully settled into the show. Alexandra Chando played Kristen Baxter in the first season, and what she created in that role was genuinely compelling. Kristen was the eldest Baxter daughter, a young single mother who had become a parent before she was fully formed herself, trying to balance the demands of raising her son Boyd while living under a roof with parents whose worldview did not always align with her own. The character's blend of resilience and uncertainty felt specific and real. The dynamic between Kristen and her father was the kind of on-screen relationship that audiences invest in because it captures something true about how parents and adult children negotiate the gap between generations. When the announcement came that she would not be returning for the second season, the explanation offered to the public was the phrase that Hollywood uses when it does not want to discuss what actually happened: creative differences. 2 words that can cover an enormous range of actual circumstances, from genuine artistic disagreements to personal conflicts to simple business decisions that were never really about creativity at all. The decision to recast Kristen was driven partly by a straightforward production concern that had nothing to do with performance. The 3 Baxter daughters needed to feel like they belonged in a specific order. Kristen was the eldest. The actress playing Kristen in the first season was actually younger than the actress playing the middle daughter. for audiences paying careful attention. This created a nagging visual inconsistency that the production team felt would eventually become a problem the show could not ignore. Amanda Fuller, who stepped into the role for the second season and held it through the remainder of the series, was older than both of her predecessors in the role, which gave the sibling hierarchy a physical coherence it had previously lacked. There was also a creative ambition behind the recast that went beyond solving a visual problem. The producers wanted Kristen's storyline to evolve in a direction that required a certain kind of lived-in quality. The version of Kristen they were building toward in later seasons, the woman who has grown past the immediate crisis of early unexpected parenthood into someone grappling with larger questions about identity and purpose, needed an actress who could carry that weight convincingly. Fuller brought something to the role that served the show's longer ambitions, and over the course of her tenure, she became so integral to the Baxter family dynamic that it became genuinely difficult to remember that anyone else had ever played the part. The character of Ryan, Kristen's ex-boyfriend and the father of her son Boyd, went through a transformation that was arguably even more dramatic than the one Kristen herself experienced. The version of Ryan who first appeared on the show was essentially a plot function dressed in teenage irresponsibility. He existed to establish that Kristen had made a difficult choice young, that the consequences of that choice were ongoing, and that the Baxter family contained complicated interpersonal dynamics that extended beyond its immediate members. The performer who originated the role was barely out of his teens himself, and the interpretation of Ryan he offered was appropriately unformed, a young man who had run from responsibility and was now being confronted with it again without any particular readiness to engage honestly. When the show's creative leadership changed going into the second season, the ambition for what Ryan could become changed with it. The new showrunner saw in the character an opportunity that the original conception had not exploited. Ryan, properly developed, could be something far more interesting than a narrative inconvenience. He could be the show's most effective intellectual sparring partner for Mike Baxter, someone whose worldview was genuinely different rather than simply younger. Someone whose disagreements with his father-in-law went beyond generation gap into actual philosophical conflict about what America was and what it should be. Jordan Masterson, who stepped into the role and held it through the remainder of the original run and the revival, understood the version of Ryan the writers were building and inhabited it with a specificity that made the character essential. His Ryan grew from a recovered deadbeat into something genuinely complicated. A man with strong convictions that Mike found genuinely exasperating, partly because they were held with the same kind of conviction that Mike held his own. The cannabis business storyline that the show developed in later seasons created the additional irony of watching Ryan's successful capitalist enterprise confirm economic principles he had previously argued against, which gave Tim Allen's character a particular kind of satisfaction that the show mined for considerable comedy. The cancellation that arrived after 6 successful seasons was the event that truly scrambled the cast, and the circumstances surrounding it remained genuinely controversial in ways that the official explanations never fully resolved. From a pure numbers perspective, the cancellation made no sense. The show was delivering audiences that any network would have been grateful to have. It was one of the most watched comedies on its network. Its ratings had held with a consistency that most shows at comparable points in their runs can only aspire to. The announced reason that the network was moving away from comedy on the night the show aired in favor of different programming priorities was technically accurate as a description of what happened without coming close to explaining why it happened. The context that surrounded the decision was harder to ignore. Tim Allen had recently made public comments that drew significant attention. Remarks that framed his experience as a conservative in the entertainment industry in terms that were confrontational enough to generate substantial coverage and considerable criticism. Whether those comments influenced the network's decision is something that everyone with knowledge of the decision has publicly denied. Whether those denials reflect the complete picture is something that the people who made the cancellation decision and the people affected by it have consistently disagreed about. The cast's response was unguarded in ways that suggested the decision had genuinely caught them off guard. Allen expressed feeling blindsided in terms that went beyond the usual diplomatic disappointment of television actors at cancellations. Nancy Travis, who had built Vanessa Baxter into one of the most genuinely funny television wives of her era, shared her feelings with an emotional directness that felt authentic rather than performed. Hector Elizondo, who Zed Alzate had become one of the show's most beloved supporting characters, offered observations about the cancellation that did not fully align with the network's stated reasoning. Among the younger cast members, the reaction was notably different. Molly Ephraim and Caitlin Dever, who played the two younger Baxter daughters, were at earlier stages of their careers and processed the cancellation through the lens of the opportunities it might create. They were not ready to invest additional months waiting to see whether the show might be saved. They started looking for their next chapter immediately, a decision that would have significant consequences when the revival eventually arrived. The fan campaign that followed the cancellation was remarkable enough to deserve its own accounting. Television shows get canceled regularly, and television audiences regularly object to those cancellations. What happened with Last Man Standing was qualitatively different from the standard audience protest. Petitions gathered hundreds of thousands of signatures, faster than similar efforts for comparable shows had managed. The social media response was sustained and coordinated in ways that suggested genuine passion rather than reflexive outrage. People who had been watching quietly for years found their voices simultaneously and produced a volume of response that was difficult to ignore. Physical deliveries arrived at network offices that referenced the show's blue-collar identity. The campaign reached into political circles, where figures who saw the cancellation as confirmation of cultural biases they had long suspected used their platforms to amplify the audience's frustration. Behind the scenes, the economics of the situation were also creating pressure that the network response had not anticipated. The show's production company began quietly testing interest at other networks almost immediately. The financial structure that had made the show expensive for its original network, with production costs and talent fees that reflected both the show's success and the negotiating position that success created, was now a different kind of leverage. Other networks were doing arithmetic about whether those same costs might make sense at their own operations, where the audience the show reliably delivered would represent a significantly better result against their existing numbers. Fox eventually committed to reviving the show with a production investment that reflected both their confidence in the existing audience and their awareness that they were buying something with an established identity rather than developing something new. The timeline between announcement and premiere was compressed in ways that created genuine production stress, but the creative team had material and history to draw on that new shows do not have, which partially compensated for the compressed schedule. The revival brought back most of the cast, but not all of them, and the absences reshaped the show in ways that required creative solutions. Molly Ephraim had made her peace with the show's apparent ending and built new professional commitments around that understanding. By the time the revival was announced, she was no longer available in the way that a series regular needs to be available. The decision to recast Mandy Baxter rather than write the character out or reduce her to occasional appearances was driven by the same logic that had motivated the Kristen recast years earlier. Mandy was too central to the family dynamic to diminish, and the production's history with recasting suggested they were willing to accept the audience friction that comes with an unfamiliar face in a familiar role if the casting choice ultimately served the character. Molly McHugh, who took the role, arrived knowing that a portion of the audience would resist her simply for not being her predecessor. The online response confirmed that expectation quickly, rather than attempting to replicate what Ephraim had created, which would have produced a pale copy that satisfied no one. She found aspects of the character that the previous portrayal had not fully explored and developed those. The fashion obsession that had always been part of Mandy became something she could invest in deeply. The relationship with her husband Kyle and the challenges of pregnancy and early parenthood gave her serious material that the character's earlier seasons had not required. Over time, the resistance that had greeted her arrival softened, partly because she was genuinely good, and partly because audiences who watch a character long enough tend to bond with the performance in front of them regardless of what preceded it. Caitlin Dever's situation was more complicated and ultimately produced a more interesting result than the straightforward absence might have. The years between the cancellation and the revival had transformed her professional standing completely. The projects she had committed to during those years had proven to be among the most critically celebrated work of their respective formats. Her performance in a historical drama exploring institutional failure earned nominations from major award bodies. Her work in a coming-of-age comedy that had arrived seemingly from nowhere and immediately established itself as one of the most beloved films of its year demonstrated range that her last man standing work had suggested, but not fully displayed. A Netflix limited series in which she played a survivor navigating a system designed to fail her showed what she was capable of when given material and direction that matched her abilities. She had become, in the time that Last Man Standing was off the air, exactly the kind of actress who receives premium offers for premium projects, which meant that the returning show was now competing for her time against a field of opportunities that had not existed when she first took the role of Eve Baxter. The resolution of this tension was a creative arrangement that used Eve's absence as a storytelling element rather than simply a casting acknowledgement. Sending the character to a military academy gave Eve a reason to be present intermittently rather than continuously, allowed the writers to make her returns feel like events rather than continuity, and gave Dever the flexibility to pursue projects that her talent had made available to her. The physical limitations that the pandemic added to an already complicated scheduling situation created additional layers of difficulty, with quarantine requirements turning what might have been a simple guest appearance into a significant logistical commitment that had to be weighed against whatever she was otherwise committed to in any given production period. The crossover that ended the show's run brought everything full circle in a way that required navigating legal and institutional obstacles that nearly prevented it from happening at all. The idea of connecting Last Man Standing to Tim Allen's previous iconic sitcom had been discussed throughout the show's existence. It was the kind of narrative possibility that writers naturally gravitate toward when they have an asset as unusual as an actor playing two distinct but clearly related characters across two separate beloved properties. The challenges were never creative. The challenges were always legal and logistical, involving rights held by different entities, negotiated over years through representatives with competing interests, in a context where any single party's reluctance could end the conversation.